There is a photograph that exists in the Whitfield family album that nobody in that family likes to talk about anymore. It was taken on a Saturday morning in June, in the driveway of a lake house in upstate New York. And in it, 7 members of one of the wealthiest families in the county are standing in a half circle laughing, not posing, not smiling for the camera the way people do when they know they're being photographed. This is the kind of laughter that happens before anyone has time to decide whether laughing is appropriate, the kind that catches people mid-breath and mid-thought, because something in front of them has struck every single one of them as funny at exactly the same moment. What they are laughing at is parked just behind them in plain view in the middle of a driveway lined with cars that cost more than most houses, a faded green pickup truck, rust climbing up both wheel wells. One headlight held in place with a strip of electrical tape that someone clearly hadn't bothered to remove before driving 40 minutes to a wedding. Standing beside that truck, in a suit that does not quite fit him through the shoulders, is a man named Daniel Cole. He is holding a small box wrapped carefully in brown paper. And in approximately 4 hours, this man, standing alone next to his truck while 7 members of his soon-to-be wife's family laugh at him without bothering to lower their voices, is going to marry Margaret Whitfield, the eldest daughter of that family. The daughter nobody in that driveway had ever taken particularly seriously. Nobody standing there that morning, not Margaret's mother, not her father, not her sister, not a single guest who would arrive over the following hours, had the faintest idea who Daniel Cole actually was. And 5 years later, almost every person captured laughing in that photograph would walk back up that same driveway not to laugh but to ask Daniel Cole directly and in person for help. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to where this story actually begins. To understand what happened in that driveway on the morning of June 14, 2006, you first need to understand what it had been like for Margaret Whitfield to grow up inside her own family, because the driveway was not really the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment when something that had been true for 38 years finally became visible to everyone standing close enough to see it. Margaret was born in 1968, the first child of Harold and Patricia Whitfield, and for the first 3 years of her life she occupied, by every account available from relatives who were around at the time, the entire emotional center of her parents' world. That changed in 1971 when her younger sister Caroline was born, and from almost the moment Caroline could walk and talk and perform for a room, the emotional center of the Whitfield household quietly and permanently relocated. Nobody ever announced this shift. Nobody sat Margaret down and explained it to her. It simply happened, the way these things happen in families, through 1,000 small moments that none of them individually meant very much but that, added together over years, built something as solid and unmistakable as a wall. By the time the girls were in high school, the roles inside that house had calcified into something that almost felt ceremonial. Caroline was the daughter you brought to the country club, the daughter whose photographs went on the mantle, the daughter whose opinions were solicited at dinner even when nobody particularly needed them. Margaret was the daughter who handled things, the schedules, the seating charts, the paperwork connected to the family's grocery and real estate holdings that her father found tedious and that somehow, without anyone formally deciding it should be her job, became her job anyway. And here is the part of this that matters most, the part that explains everything that came afterward. Margaret was good at it. Not adequately good, not good enough to get by, but genuinely, unusually good in a way that very few people in her family ever stopped to notice, because the work she was good at was the kind of work that, when done well, becomes invisible. She had a sharp head for numbers. She understood contracts in a way that made the family's lawyers occasionally glance at her with something like surprise. She could look at a property's financials and see, often within minutes, exactly where the soft spots were. But being quietly excellent at the unglamorous machinery of a family business does not, in families built the way the Whitfields were built, translate into being taken seriously. It translates into being relied upon. And those are not the same thing, even though from the outside they can look remarkably similar. Margaret attended the State University 2 hours from the lake house, studied accounting because it felt practical and because nobody objected, and came back afterward to work quietly inside the family's real estate division. She dated occasionally throughout her 20s and early 30s, nothing that ever became serious, and by the time she turned 34, her mother had stopped introducing her to new acquaintances as my daughter Margaret and had started introducing her, with a small sigh worked seamlessly into the sentence, as my older daughter. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. She simply never said anything about it because saying something about it had never, in her experience, changed anything at all. 40 minutes from the Whitfield Lake house, in a town most people in that county couldn't have pointed to on a map without help, a different kind of childhood was unfolding, one that would eventually intersect with Margaret's in a way that neither of their families could have predicted. Daniel Cole's father ran a small auto repair shop, the kind that had been in the same location for over 20 years and that everyone in town used because everyone in town had always used it. His mother taught 3rd grade. Daniel was the kind of child who took things apart, not out of destructiveness, but out of a genuine and quiet need to understand how the pieces fit together, and that need didn't go away as he got older. It simply moved from engines to something larger. He attended community college for 2 years, studying mechanical engineering, before the money ran out and he went to work full-time at his father's shop, which was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of outcome everyone who knew the Cole family would have expected and considered entirely respectable. What almost nobody knew, what Daniel didn't particularly advertise because there was no reason to and because, frankly, it didn't occur to him that it was the sort of thing people would find remarkable, was that since the age of 19, Daniel Cole had been quietly investing small amounts of money into a handful of companies he understood: manufacturing businesses, logistics businesses, the unglamorous companies that build the things other companies depend on. He understood machines. He understood, by extension, the businesses that made them. And he had been putting small, careful amounts of money into those businesses for years. With the same patient attention he once given to engines on his father's lift, Margaret and Daniel met in the spring of 2002, at a community fundraiser that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. Margaret was there representing her family's real estate division, which had donated a modest sponsorship. Daniel was there because his father's shop had donated a service voucher to the silent auction, and somebody needed to be present to explain what the voucher actually covered. They ended up standing near the coffee table for the better part of an hour, talking of all things about local zoning regulations, a topic that Margaret happened to know an enormous amount about, and that almost nobody at that fundraiser had ever asked her a genuine question about before. Margaret would later describe that conversation more than once as the first time in years that someone had asked her something and then actually waited to hear the answer, rather than using the gap in conversation to redirect towards something else. They began seeing each other quietly over the following months. Margaret didn't rush to introduce Daniel to her family, and when she eventually examined her own reasons for that much later, she would admit to herself that it wasn't really about timing. It was that she already knew with a kind of tired and specific certainty almost exactly how the introduction would go. When she finally did bring Daniel home, in the fall of 2004, the reaction unfolded almost precisely the way she had privately predicted, which she found, in a strange way, less painful than if it had surprised her. Her mother, within the first 10 minutes of the visit, asked what Daniel's family did. When the answer came back, auto repair, Patricia Whitfield's smile did not change at all, not even slightly, but something behind her eyes shifted in a way that Margaret had seen before, aimed at other people, and recognized immediately. Her father was more direct about it. Over dinner, Harold Whitfield asked Daniel what his 5-year plan was, the kind of question that, in the Whitfield family, functioned less as genuine curiosity and more as a sorting mechanism. Daniel thought about it for a moment and then said simply that he planned to keep working at the shop and see where things went from there. It was, Margaret would say many years later, the single most honest answer anyone had given at that dinner table in longer than she could remember. It was also, to her father, exactly the confirmation he had already half decided he was looking for. The engagement went forward anyway, the following year, not with any real blessing from Margaret's parents, but with the particular, quiet kind of tolerance that families like the Whitfields sometimes extend to decisions they've privately concluded aren't worth the energy of a fight. And then, almost as if the universe wanted to underline the entire situation in red ink, Caroline got engaged 6 months later, to a man named Bradley Pierce of the Pierce family, a name that meant something specific in at least 3 counties. The proposal reportedly involved a private chartered flight and made the society pages of 2 regional newspapers within the week. Both weddings, as it happened, were scheduled for the very same summer. And then, through nothing more than the ordinary chaos of venue availability and caterer schedules, for the very same week, the morning of June 14, 2006, The Whitfield Lake house was, by every account from the people who were there, a study in contrasts so stark that more than one guest later described it as almost surreal. Caroline's wedding to Bradley Pierce was scheduled for that evening, an event for roughly 300 guests at a private club 20 minutes away, with a budget that Harold Whitfield had reportedly stopped saying out loud because the number had started to embarrass even him. Margaret's wedding to Daniel Cole was scheduled for that same afternoon at the lake house itself, with around 40 guests total, using a caterer that Patricia had selected. Several people would later recall, specifically because it was, in her words, appropriate for the occasion, a phrase that did an enormous amount of quiet work in a very small number of syllables. Margaret's dress had been altered from her mother's own wedding gown, taken in at the waist, let out at the hem, adjusted twice more after that. It was by any honest measure a lovely dress. It was also unmistakably, and to anyone who looked closely, a dress that had clearly belonged to someone else first. Caroline's gown, by contrast, had arrived from a design house in Manhattan 3 weeks earlier inside a box so large it had required 2 people to carry it up the stairs. At around 10 o'clock that morning, while the house was already full of caterers and florists and a hairdresser working through both brides' appointments back to back, a faded green pickup truck turned into the driveway. What happened over the next 15 seconds is something that 7 different people, interviewed separately over the years that followed, have described in almost identical terms, which is in itself worth sitting with for a moment, because when 7 people who weren't coordinating with each other all remember the same 15 seconds the same way, it usually means those 15 seconds mattered considerably more than anyone wanted to admit at the time they were happening. Daniel parked the truck off to the side, near the side entrance, careful not to block any of the other vehicles already crowding the driveway. He stepped out wearing a suit that, by his own later and very matter-of-fact admission, he had purchased off the rack 2 days earlier and hadn't had time to get properly fitted, because between his work at the shop and everything else there simply hadn't been a window. He was carrying a small box, wrapped in brown paper, which he would later say contained a gift for Margaret, something he had made himself in his father's shop with his own hands. It was Caroline who saw him first. She said something to her mother, quietly gesturing toward the truck with what witnesses described as a small, almost involuntary motion of her chin. Whatever she said made Patricia Whitfield laugh, and once that laugh started, it didn't really stop on its own. Harold Whitfield turned to look. 2 of Caroline's bridesmaids turned to look. A cousin named Robert, who had driven up from the city that morning, turned to look. And within a handful of seconds, the entire group standing in that driveway, 7 people in total, was laughing at the truck, at the rust along the wheel wells, at the headlight held together with electrical tape, at the man standing beside it in a suit that didn't quite fit, holding a small brown paper package. Waiting patiently for someone to tell him where he was supposed to go, Daniel stood there through all of it. Witnesses placed the duration somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds, which doesn't sound like very long until you imagine standing inside it. He didn't say anything. His expression, according to every person who described it, didn't change in any dramatic way. And then Margaret appeared at the top of the steps, still in her robe, her hair only half finished, having come outside to see what all the noise was about. She took in the scene in an instant, the way you take in something you've somehow always known was coming even though you couldn't have said when. She walked down the steps, took Daniel's hand and walked him directly into the house without a single word to anyone standing in that driveway. What was said between the 2 of them once they were inside, alone in the kitchen, away from the guests and the caterers and the noise, is something that only Margaret and Daniel know for certain. But Margaret described it in broad strokes to one close friend years later, and that account has remained remarkably consistent every time it's been retold. She apologized to him. He told her there was nothing for her to apologize for. She said something about how on some level she had always known this was exactly how the day would go, that she had married into an entire wedding, not just a husband, and that the wedding had simply been waiting for its moment to make itself known. And Daniel said something in response that Margaret would carry with her, in her own words, for the rest of her life. He told her that the truck was the same truck he'd owned since he was 22 years old, that he had never replaced it because he had never needed to, and that someday, not that day, not soon, but someday, she would understand exactly why that mattered. At the time, standing in that kitchen in her half-finished hair and her mother's altered dress, Margaret took this the way anyone would have taken it. As comfort. As a kind man trying to make her feel better after a humiliating moment the way kind people do, with words that sound a little larger than the situation strictly requires. It would be 5 years before she understood that Daniel Cole had, in that kitchen, told her as plainly and as honestly as he was capable of telling anyone exactly who he was, and that almost nobody standing in that driveway 20 minutes earlier had been paying anywhere near close enough attention to hear it. The wedding went forward that afternoon on schedule, with 40 guests and a caterer chosen for being appropriate, and a groom in a suit that didn't fit, standing at the front of a small gathering, holding the hand of a bride whose family had, just hours earlier, spent 10 uninterrupted seconds laughing at the only completely honest thing in their entire driveway. In the years that followed, 2 marriages moved forward in directions that, to anyone watching only casually from the outside, would have looked exactly the way everyone in that driveway had already decided they would look. Caroline and Bradley Pierce settled into a life that matched their wedding in every visible respect: a large home 20 minutes from the lake house, the right memberships, occasional appearances in the regional society pages a handful of times a year. Margaret and Daniel moved into a modest house near Daniel's father's shop. Margaret continued working inside her family's real estate division, the same quiet, essential, largely invisible role she had always occupied. Daniel continued working at the shop, though starting around 2007. His father began noticing that Daniel was spending more and more of his evenings on the computer, a detail his father mentioned occasionally to other people, with mild curiosity and no real concern, the way you might mention that your son had picked up a new hobby. What almost nobody on either side of this story had any real reason to understand was that the small, careful portfolio Daniel had been quietly building since he was 19 years old had, by 2008, grown into something considerably larger than the word portfolio usually implies. He held meaningful positions by that point in several manufacturing and logistics companies, the unglamorous backbone businesses that rarely make headlines but that everything else quietly depends on. And in 2008, during a year that most people in this country remember for entirely different reasons, several of those positions, purchased years earlier at prices that reflected just how unfashionable those industries had been at the time, became considerably more valuable than almost anyone, including Daniel, had originally projected. He didn't tell anyone, not his parents, who had no framework for even asking the right questions. Not for a while, even Margaret, in any real detail, though by 2009 she knew enough, simply from living inside the same house and paying the kind of close attention she had always paid to numbers, to understand that their household finances no longer looked anything like what anyone observing their daily life, including the truck still parked in their driveway every single day, would ever have guessed. While all of this was happening quietly on Daniel's side, something very different, and considerably less quiet in its eventual consequences, was happening to the Whitfield family business. The grocery chain that had originally built the family's fortune had been losing ground for years against larger competitors, a slow erosion that had started well before 2006 but accelerated sharply afterward. Harold Whitfield, by his own later and somewhat reluctant admission, had been slow to adapt, slow to see what was coming, in the specific way that people who have never had to adapt before are often the slowest to recognize when adaptation becomes necessary. The real estate division, the one Margaret had spent her entire career inside, had also taken on significant debt in the years leading up to 2006, betting on continued growth in property values that, in the years that followed, simply didn't materialize the way the family had assumed it would. By 2010, the Whitfield family's overall financial position was, according to one person who was close to the family during this period, considerably more fragile than anyone outside the immediate family had any idea. The grocery chain had closed 2 locations. The real estate division was carrying debt that was becoming genuinely difficult to service. And Harold Whitfield, 71 years old by this point and not in particularly good health, was facing a choice between selling off significant family assets, including potentially the lake house itself, or finding some other way to restructure the family's obligations before the situation became public in ways that would be considerably more embarrassing than anything that had ever happened in a driveway. Margaret, working every day inside the real estate division, watched all of this unfold in close to real time. She understood the numbers as she had always understood numbers, better than almost anyone else in her family, including her father. But she also understood something else, something she had understood for most of her adult life. That for years, her input on exactly these kinds of questions had been politely received and quietly set aside, again and again, in a pattern so consistent it had stopped even registering as something worth being upset about. And so, for a while, Margaret simply watched and waited. In early 2011, the Whitfield family's real estate division, acting through their attorneys, reached out to a private investment group that had over the previous 2 years been quietly and selectively acquiring distressed regional real estate holdings across the broader area. According to the public filings the Whitfield family's lawyers reviewed before that outreach, this investment group had been operating under the name Cole Capital Partners since 2009. Nobody on the Whitfield side made any connection at all. Cole is not, after all, an especially uncommon name, and nothing in the filings the lawyers reviewed gave anyone the slightest reason to look twice. A meeting was scheduled for March of 2011 at the offices of the Whitfield family's attorney to discuss what was by that point essentially a lifeline, an investment arrangement that could restructure the real estate division's debt and keep the family from having to sell the lake house and several other holdings outright. Harold Whitfield attended. Patricia Whitfield attended. The family's longtime attorney attended. The investment group, for its part, sent a single representative. He walked into the conference room
I believe I'm expected.
wearing a suit that, this time, fit him perfectly. He shook hands with the attorney first in the unhurried way of someone who has done this many times before. He shook hands with Harold Whitfield next. And then he turned to Patricia Whitfield, the woman who 5 years earlier, almost to the week, had been the very first person in that driveway to laugh, and he said, according to every account from people who heard it directly, with what they each separately described as complete and total composure, "Mrs. Whitfield, it's good to see you again. I believe the last time we met I was driving a different car." The room, by every account, went completely silent. Patricia Whitfield did not place him immediately, and not, it seems, because the memory wasn't there somewhere, but because the man standing in front of her now existed so entirely outside the category she had filed him into 5 years earlier that her mind, quite literally, needed a moment to catch up to what her eyes were already telling her. It was Harold who got there first. He had met Daniel exactly once back in 2004 at that dinner where he'd asked him about his 5-year plan. Harold Whitfield, staring now at the man who represented the investment group holding his family's entire financial future in its hands, said only one word: Daniel. Daniel Cole, son-in-law, owner of a green pickup truck with one headlight held on by electrical tape, and managing partner of an investment firm that by 2011 held positions in real estate, manufacturing, and logistics across 4 states, simply nodded once and said, "It's good to see you both again." What followed, according to every person who was in that room, was one of the most surreal business meetings any of them had ever participated in. Daniel laid out, calmly and in considerable detail, exactly what his firm was prepared to offer, terms that the Whitfield family's own attorney would later describe, reviewing them afterward in private, as better than they had any right to expect, frankly, given the actual condition of the real estate division's finances. But Daniel also laid out, with that same unhurried calm, exactly what that division had actually been worth for the past several years, and exactly how close it had come more than once to a situation considerably worse than the one the family currently found itself in. He wasn't cruel about any of it. Every single person in that room was unanimous on that point then and in every retelling since. He didn't bring up the driveway. He didn't bring up the laughter or the truck or the suit that hadn't fit. He simply did his job thoroughly, fairly, and with a level of preparation that made it obvious to everyone in that room that he had been looking closely at this family's finances for quite some time before this meeting had ever been scheduled. When the meeting ended, Harold Whitfield, according to 2 people who were present, asked Daniel, somewhat hoarsely, why his firm, out of every investment group in the region that could plausibly have made this offer, had chosen to make it. And Daniel's answer, simple and immediate, was this: "Margaret asked me to look into it, about 6 months ago." And this is the part of the story that changes everything that came before it, because up until this point, it would be easy to assume this is simply a story about a man who turned out to be secretly wealthy, the kind of story that ends the moment the truth comes out. But that was never actually the story. The real story is what Margaret did quietly with what she knew. Margaret had understood since roughly 2009 approximately how significant Daniel's holdings had become, in the way that you understand things about the person you live with every day, gradually, through small accumulating details rather than any single conversation. She had also watched for years as her own family's business slowly came apart at the seams, and as her input on that business continued to be quietly set aside, exactly as it always had been, even as the situation grew more serious. In late 2010, when the real estate division's numbers reached a point where Margaret could see with total clarity precisely where things were heading, she made a decision. She didn't go to her father. She didn't go to her mother. She went to her husband, the man in the truck, and she asked him to take a serious look at it, not as a favor, not out of sentiment, as a business opportunity to be evaluated on its own merits the exact same way his firm evaluated anything else that came across his desk. If the numbers worked, they worked. If they didn't, they didn't, and nothing more would be said about it. The numbers worked. And Margaret Whitfield Cole, the daughter who had spent her entire life being the one who quietly handled things without ever being asked what she actually thought, had arranged, single-handedly and without a single person in her family having any idea, the most consequential business decision in that family's recent history. The investment closed that summer in 2011, almost exactly 5 years to the week after the photograph in the driveway was taken. The terms restructured the real estate division's debt, kept the lake house in the family, and gave Daniel's firm a significant ownership stake in what remained of the Whitfield holdings. Harold Whitfield, in the months that followed, stepped back from day-to-day involvement in the business, citing his health, though more than one person close to the family quietly suggested there was something else at play as well. A man, late in life, confronting the uncomfortable realization that he had spent years underestimating the two people in his own family who had, the entire time, quietly been the most capable people in any room they were in. A few weeks after the deal closed, Patricia Whitfield organized a family dinner at the lake house, the first time the extended family had gathered there since the wedding 5 years earlier. Margaret and Daniel were invited, of course, the way they had always technically been invited to everything. What was different this time was how they were received. When Daniel's car pulled into the driveway, not the truck which he still kept and still occasionally drove out at his parents' place, but a car that by any reasonable measure fit the man who now held a stake in the family's business, Patricia Whitfield walked out personally to greet him. Caroline, who 5 years earlier had been the very first to gesture and laugh, came down the steps to shake his hand with what one witness that evening described as the careful warmth of someone trying very hard to recalibrate 5 years of memory in real time. Nobody mentioned the truck. Nobody mentioned the driveway or the laughter or the suit that hadn't fit. But everyone in that house that evening understood, completely and without needing to say it out loud, exactly what everyone else in the room was thinking about. Later that evening, after dinner, Margaret found a few minutes alone with her mother in the kitchen, the same kitchen where 5 years earlier she had stood with Daniel after walking him in from the driveway. Patricia, according to Margaret's later account, tried to apologize haltingly and awkwardly, the way people do when what they're actually apologizing for isn't one single moment, but an entire pattern they're only now, for the first time, able to see clearly enough to name. Margaret's response, as she described it afterward, wasn't angry and it wasn't triumphant either. She told her mother that she understood. That for her entire life she had been the daughter who handled things, and that handling things quietly in the end was exactly what she had done. She told her mother that she hadn't needed anyone standing in that driveway 5 years earlier to see Daniel clearly. She had seen him clearly the entire time. That had always been enough for her, even when it had clearly not been enough for anyone else. What this story leaves you with in the end isn't really a story about money, or about a truck, or even about one uncomfortable morning in a driveway in upstate New York. It's a question about how often any of us decide in the space of 5 seconds who someone is, based on what they're driving, what they're wearing, or where we've already decided before they've said a single word that they belong. And it's a question about how many people, sitting quietly in rooms where they've been underestimated for years, aren't waiting for revenge at all. They're simply waiting for the moment when the truth becomes obvious entirely on its own without anyone having to point at it. Was the Whitfield family wrong to laugh that morning? Almost certainly. But the more interesting question, the one worth sitting with after this video ends, is this. How many people are you underestimating right now today for exactly the same reasons? Let us know what you think about this story, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.